let me just do the usual introduction, please. Thank you for joining VSET today. Today we have Piotr Dworczak from Northwestern, who's going to present optimal where agents are unsophisticated. We're pleased to have Jiangtao Li, who's the co-author here, and then guest panelist Yannai Gonczarowski from Microsoft and Piotr Troyan from Virginia. I believe Yannai is the first ever computer scientist in the series, so nice to have a change like that. The format of
nice to be here, and thank you for the invite.
The format of a seminar is a 60 minutes presentation, a 15-minute session for question and discussion. I would ask everybody to please be muted during the talk, but you can post questions, comments, whatever in the chat. The panelists, Jiangtao, are all going to be monitoring that. We are going to be monitoring that. So sometimes we might, especially if it's a clarification question, intervene and stop Piotr and ask him the question directly. Before I hand it over to Piotr, let me remind you that these seminars take place every Thursday at 4 p.m. UK time. Next week, the speaker is Jan Agenbach from Sciences Po. She'll talk about selective memory of a psychological agent. The guest panelists will be Yvle Wong and Elliot Lipnowski. And you, as usual, you can find more information about us on our website or by following us on Twitter. Okay, Piotr, the screen is yours.
All right, thanks a lot. Thanks for inviting me. Thanks, Jiangtao, for joining despite the late hour in Singapore, and thanks, Peter and Yannai, for being in the panel. So just one comment. This is supposed to be hopefully a fun paper to talk about, and I have to warn you, we have more questions than answers. So please do not expect that you will have a full understanding of these issues. Please expect to be a little bit confused, but hopefully in a good way. That sort of provokes you to think about these issues just like we were inspired to think about them. All right, I'm going to start with an uncontroversial claim that real-life economic agents are not as rational as we typically model them in economic theory. And but when the mechanism and literature has not been oblivious to that fact, and in fact, it has responded recently with various notions of simple mechanisms that are supposed to be easy in some sense to understand and to participate in. And both Peter and Yannai and Jiangtao have contributed to this literature. Now, let me clarify what we mean by simplicity. Specifically, we mean strategic simplicity. Roughly, what we have in mind is that it should be easy for agents to identify an optimal way to behave in the mechanism. So for this paper, let me be even more precise at this point. We're going to make some assumption about the level of strategic sophistication of the agents. And then we're going to call a mechanism simple if, given that assumption, agents can determine their optimal strategy, right? So in contrast, the mechanism is called complex when at least one agent is strategically confused. So that's a formal term. Being confused means that at least one type of one agent does not know how to choose an optimal strategy, is confused by at least two of them, given that level of sophistication that we assumed. So to make it more concrete, let me give you 3 examples of solution concepts that we're going to look at in this paper. The first one is the classical notion of a strategy proof or a dominant strategy mechanism. What is the sort of corresponding assumption about agents' rationality or lack of sophistication? It's that agents cannot make predictions about other agent strategies. So if we make that assumption that agents are not able to make those predictions, they will, for example, not know how to play a base-Nash equilibrium, but they will know how to play if they have a dominant strategy. And so precisely this set of strategy-proof mechanisms is the set of simple mechanisms for such agents. They still know how to play those mechanisms in the sense they have a unique best strategy they can identify. Now, this is sort of not strong enough, as was famously observed by Jiangtao Li in his famous papers on OSP mechanisms. So this notion of an obviously strategy-proof mechanism is even more restrictive, and there's a corresponding weaker assumption about agents' rationality, in that additionally, agents are not even assumed to be able to engage in contingent reasoning. What's contingent reasoning? It means that in the SP case, I fix a strategy of other players, a strategy profile, and I make a sort of case-by-case comparison of any of my two strategies. Here, I cannot do contingent reasoning. So to choose a strategy, to recognize it as optimal, it has to be that the worst thing that happens under my chosen strategy is better than the best thing that can happen under any alternative strategy. And this leads to this class of OSP mechanisms that are simple for agents with this level of sophistication. And then Peter has a beautiful paper with Marek Picha that does lots of different things, but as one of the things they introduce an even stronger class or solution concept, an even more restrictive class of simple mechanisms where agents additionally also cannot predict their own future moves. And Peter, correct me if I'm wrong, but this is roughly speaking motivated by something like a game of chess, right? So a game of chess is an OSP mechanism. People have an obvious dominant strategy, but sort of equally obviously, it's not that easy to play chess. And one way to formalize this idea, as Peter and Marek do in their paper, is to say that agents cannot predict exactly how they will behave in the future. So when they evaluate these strategies, they also take the min and the max over what they're going to do in the future information sets. And that leads to an even smaller class of simple mechanisms. All right, so these are examples.
Chess was not the it was not the motivation, but it was an ex post realization that it worked. I have to. But
anyway, I like this. I like this justification. Yeah. So just we have three assumptions about agents' lack of sophistication, and then three corresponding classes of simple mechanisms. But the story typically told in these papers and others that focus on simplicity is basically that when agents are unsophisticated, we should use a simple mechanism because then they know what to do. And the story that we want to explore in this paper is kind of the opposite story. So is it maybe the case that when agents are unsophisticated, then precisely then, we might want to use a complex mechanism to kind of confuse them on purpose and exploit their lack of sophistication, right? And that's going to be true in some sense, as we will show, even if we take participation incentives into account, right? So obviously, if we make the mechanism complex, we might worry that agents will be concerned about participating in this mechanism, but we can actually incorporate participation decisions as well. And so the main message of the paper is that even though it's true that if you use a simple mechanism as a designer, you can predict play, given that lack of strategic sophistication by your agents, this may not be enough to justify the use of simple mechanisms. So a bit more concretely, here's our approach. We're going to fix a solution concept. So essentially, for the three solution concepts that I talked about, our results, at least the ones I'm going to talk about today, are going to be true. So we can sort of fix the one that you like the most, right? Formally, what we assume is that agents will not play a K-dominated strategy, or K.
Can I jump in and ask you a question here? Sorry. Is there any like concise thing that you would demand from solution concepts to fit it that you can phrase so that it's easy to tell if this fits other solution concepts as well, or is this specifically for these three solution concepts?
So our results are specifically for these three. And in the proofs, we kind of prove it separately for the three cases. So we haven't come up with kind of a parameterization of solution concept that will allow us to use single argument to cover a range of them. But our choice was sort of guided by having a wide range. So sort of SP is kind of, in some sense, the weakest solution concept that captures this idea of simplicity. SOSP is very, very strong. And so intuitively, everything that's in between, hopefully the results will still hold, although we haven't proven it formally. So we kind of picked three examples, with OSP being kind of the middle one, and the two ones being relatively extreme, to kind of hint at robustness. But we haven't formally shown this for a larger class.
It wasn't a criticism. It was a clarification question.
No, but it's good to clarify. Yeah, it's somewhat arbitrary. We picked those three, but these three are, I think, the most prominent ones in the literature. And there is a range showing that it's not sort of a knife edge case where it only holds for one of them, but not the other ones. Okay, so a simple mechanism again, right? It's by definition a mechanism that leads to a unique outcome, because in this mechanism, people will have exactly one undominated strategy, which is also going to be dominant, and then we know what's going to happen. It's going to lead to a certain payoff for the designer. In a complex mechanism, by definition, right? There will be at least 2 undominated strategies, and therefore we won't be able to predict what's going to happen, and there's going to be a range of possible payoffs for the designer, right? But here comes the key point that we want to make. There are cases in which a complex mechanism will lead to a strictly higher payoff, okay, for the designer, strictly higher than the best simple mechanism would yield, even if we have the most adversarial selection from that range of possible payoffs. So regardless of how those confused agents will resolve their confusion, the designer is going to be strictly better off than she will be by selecting the best possible simple mechanism. Right? So roughly speaking, this means that as long as the designer just cares about her payoff, there is sort of no reason to choose a simple mechanism. In fact, it's sort of unambiguously better to choose the complex one. That being said, these are just some cases, and it's not our point to sort of criticize simplicity, because the flip side of our analysis is that we will also show some conditions under which this sort of dominance by a complex mechanism is not possible. And this will provide a foundation, an optimality foundation for simple mechanisms. So the takeaway is sort of that you have to carefully examine each environment in question before you decide whether to use a simple or a complex mechanism. Just knowing that your agents are unsophisticated is not enough to conclude that you should use a simple mechanism. Okay, and I want to show you an example. And I always somehow run out of time when I give this talk. And so the hope is that if you see the example, you'll sort of understand the gist of the idea. So if I don't convey anything other than the example, it's fine. Okay. So the example is going to be for OSP mechanisms. Okay, just to make things concrete. And I'm gonna remind you of a definition of an OSP mechanism in a second. It's an example where there's a trading platform, let's say in some financial market, and this platform intermediates trade between 2 dealers, A and B, and the platform just tries to maximize its profits, its intermediation profits. Each dealer can either buy or sell 1 unit of the asset. Right? The platform cannot hold inventory, so either A sells to B or B sells to A, or they don't trade. These are the only possible outcomes. Now, these dealers have types, which are just values for the asset. And these types are equally likely, but they are correlated across dealers. So think of some sort of common value component. So dealer A has a value of 0 or 2/3. Dealer B has a value of 1/3 or 1. Right? And there's positive correlation. These are the probabilities of these profile types, type profiles. Okay. We are interested in finding the best OSP mechanism for this setting. The best meaning the one that maximizes the profit of the platform. So very quickly, a reminder, it won't be a formal definition, I'm going to give it later, but just so that you understand the example. A strategy is obviously dominant, right? If the minimal payoff from choosing it for a player, where minimum is taken over all choices, all possible choices of opponents and nature if there is randomization, is at least as high as the maximal payoff from any alternative strategy. Okay, so it's a stronger requirement than just a dominant strategy. And there's a corresponding definition of a dominated strategy. Okay, so this is just a reminder of what an OSP mechanism looks like. So in an OSP mechanism, every type of every player has this obviously dominant strategy. All right, so Shengwu in his paper shows that personalized clock auctions are OSP, and although his former results do not cover our example, we can easily extend these results and show that a version of a personalized clock auction, ascending clock auction, in fact, is optimal here. So I claim that this is the best simple mechanism under OSP, and it works like this. The platform is going to first ask dealer A if she would like to sell the asset at a price of 0. If she says yes, then they just trade with dealer B at that price. If she says no, then the price is raised to 1/3 and dealer B is asked if she would like to sell at that price. If dealer B agrees, then they trade. If she says no, then there is no trade. Right, so it's a very simple short auction. And then whenever there is trade, the buyer in that transaction will pay a fee of 1/3 to the platform. So that's how the platform makes money. All right, so what's the expected profit of the platform? It's just the fee, 1/3, times the probability of trade. So to compute probability of trade, we have to figure out those OSP strategies for those dealers. And that's actually very simple, so I won't go through the details, but you can easily see that type 0 is happy to sell the asset at 0. Type 2/3 of dealer A, of course, will reject because her value is higher than this price. And then for dealer B, type 1/3 is willing to sell at 1/3. Type 1 will reject. And it's a very simple calculation. These strategies are obviously dominant. You can verify that. Right. So what is the profit of the platform? Well, notice that there is trade in all cases except for one, namely when both dealers reject the offers, and that happens when dealer A has type 2/3 and dealer B has type 1. So in all other cases, we get trade, which has probably 3/5. So the expected profit is 1/5. And you kind of have to believe me that's the best mechanism in the class of OSP mechanisms. But to give you some hint of why the mechanism looks like this, notice that there is obviously inefficiency here in this optimal mechanism because types 2/3 and 1 do not trade, even though there are gains from trade. And this is the usual intuition that we sort of distort the allocation efficiency to minimize information rents, right? So if these two types traded at some price that would have to be between 2/3 and 1, then this type 0 would no longer have an obviously dominant strategy because this type 0 gets exactly 0 in this equilibrium, right? And if later on there was some path in the game tree where she could sell at a much higher price, then this would no longer be an obviously dominant strategy because she could get this high payoff by rejecting and staying in the game, right? So that's sort of why we have this distortion of allocative efficiency. Okay, but this is the best thing you can do if you look at OSP mechanisms. So here comes our alternative design, an auction which is going to be better in some sense. And it's actually a descending auction. So now you kind of drop the price gradually, and it's just slightly more complicated. You first go to dealer B, and you ask if she would like to buy the asset at 1. If she says yes, they trade. If no, you drop the price to 2/3, and you ask if dealer A would like to buy the asset. If she rejects, you go back to dealer B and drop the price to 1/3. And only when this dealer says no, then there is no trade. And again, the fee is 1/3 whenever there is trade, and it's charged to the seller. Okay, so we have to see what happens in this mechanism. So for dealer A, it's very simple again, because dealer A has again just one information set. Type 2/3 is happy to buy at 2/3. Type 0 obviously wants to reject that offer. She does not want to buy it at a price higher than her value. And these are again obviously dominant strategies. For dealer B, things get more interesting. So if you type 1/3, then you don't want to buy at 1, right? You reject this offer, but you're happy to buy at 1/3. That's your value. Okay, so that's going to be an obviously dominant strategy for type 1/3. But let's look at type 1. So this type is going to be confused, as you might guess. So if type 1 accepts this initial offer, she gets 0 for sure. She buys at a price equal to her value, so she gets 0 always. If she rejects and accepts only the second offer, then there are two possibilities, right? If dealer A says no to this offer, then type 1 gets to buy at 1/3, and her value is 1, so she makes a profit of plus 2/3. But if she's unlucky and dealer A says yes to this offer, then this type 1 is actually forced to sell the asset at 2/3, which is below her value, and moreover has to pay a fee to the platform. So her profit is minus 2/3, right? So accepting the first offer gives you 0 for sure. Rejecting, accepting the second one gives you plus or minus 2/3. So obviously these two strategies cannot be ranked. Under the assumed sophistication, this type is going to be just confused. One thing we can say is that it's going to be obviously dominated to reject both offers. Okay, so that we can rule out under this assumption about rationality, but we cannot rank these two strategies. All right, so it's a complex mechanism. We don't know what's going to happen. But so here's yeah.
Sorry, let me ask. So in the previous, the ascending mechanism, you had basically trades at 0, 1/3, and 2/3, and here you have 1, 2/3, and 1/3. But you could just as easily do here trades at 2/3, 1/3, and 0, switching the order, the roles of A and B, right? I mean, that difference is not the crucial difference between these two.
No.
Right?
That's not a difference. That's not a crucial difference.
Okay, thank you.
There's kind of an arbitrary, definition of a price, because there's also the fee.
Yeah.
And it can be paid by the buyer or seller. It doesn't really matter as long as you adjust the prices. So there are multiple ways to present the same mechanism, but it doesn't matter.
Okay, thank you.
All right, so here comes the punchline. We don't know what type 1 will do. But notice that no matter what she does, no matter how she resolves this confusion, there's always trade. Trade happens with probability 1, okay? Because we never end up in this outcome, okay? And so what this means is that the platform always gets the fee of 1/3 exposed. So even regardless of the distribution of types and regardless of how this confused type behaves, the platform always gets 1/3, right? And so this is obviously strictly higher than her expected profit of 1/5 from the best simple mechanism. Right. And so, I mean, so we were kind of shocked to discover this, right? Such an example is even possible, because essentially what this example shows is that, you know, we make an assumption about agents' rationality. They won't play an obviously dominated strategy. You look for the best equilibrium in those obviously dominant strategies, and you get the best possible payoff for the designer, which is 1/5. And then it turns out you can construct a mechanism which in some sense does not have an equilibrium in this class, right? Because there is no equilibrium in the sense that you cannot determine the strategy of at least one type. But no matter what this type does, you get a strictly better payoff as the designer.
Right? Sorry, can I also jump in for a second?
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know what type 1 is going to do, but so you're kind of like forcing her to, if she says, you know, no at the first place, she might get forced to sell at this lower price. But I don't know, it's probably with the participation constraints that you're going to talk about.
Great, yeah, exactly. You're exactly right. So let's talk about that actually briefly. So in what sense does type 1 of dealer B have an incentive to participate? In the sense that non-participation is obviously dominated by one of her strategies. And here it's kind of weakly dominated, but you can sort of protract things by epsilon so that non-participation is obviously dominated by one of her undominated strategies. And we are going to call this partial incentives to participate. And so as long as you're happy with this partial notion, then this example is compelling in that it provides incentives for this dealer to participate. And so the story would be that if you want to convince dealer B to participate, you should say, hey, in this mechanism, you can do this, and you're guaranteed to get a non-negative payoff. But what Peter says is that even though it's true, this dealer might actually end up with a strictly negative payoff, right? In some case. And so you might want to have instead a stronger notion of participation incentives, which is that no matter what this dealer does, as long as she plays an undominated strategy, she always ends up with a non-negative payoff. That's a stronger notion of participation constraints. We're going to formalize it later, and in fact, we're going to prove a theorem which shows, in particular, in this example, it would not be possible to construct this example with this stronger notion of incentives to participate. So I'm going to come back to this when I talk about this more general result. But Peter is right that this example hinges on the fact that only one of those strategies for type 1 is better unambiguously than non-participation. But in some sense, we think it's relatively compelling, because if I can tell to this dealer that, look, if you do this, you're definitely not worse off than non-participating, then in some sense there is no reason not to. Like, if you just make the assumption that agents avoid obviously dominated strategies, and you think of non-participation as a strategy, then this strategy is obviously dominated, therefore would not be selected. But yeah, we'll come back to this issue of participation. All right, but this example shows you that you should not dismiss complex mechanisms, right? Sometimes by using a complex mechanism, you can be strictly better off than by using the best simple mechanism. Okay, very briefly about literature, and if we do how I'm doing on time. Okay, not very well, so I'm gonna make it brief. So obviously we build on this literature that studies simple mechanisms, and both my co-author and our panelists have contributed to this literature. The most closely related literatures are the ones on dominant strategy mechanisms and implementation with the undominated strategies. And without going into the details, let me just say that you can extract from some of these papers examples of the sort of dominance that I've just demonstrated for the solution concept of dominant strategy. Okay, so it was kind of done in a different context, but you can extract from these papers such examples. So our contribution relative to this literature is twofold. First, we're, I believe, first to study those new solution concept of OSP and SOSP. And second, we're going to provide additional insights about when such dominance is possible and when not for SP as well. And so I'm going to be more specific about these results. And since Yannai is here, I wanted to mention that in CS, there's a huge literature on simplicity versus optimality. And this is something I hope we'll discuss. But my understanding is it's a different question in that in CS, the typical question is, we have a difficult problem, and we know that the fully optimal mechanism is complicated. So the question is, how well can we do in the worst possible case by using a smaller class of simple mechanisms? For example, we have an auction setting. How well can we do with posted price mechanisms? And there's a price of anarchy type of result that sometimes says that those simple mechanisms extract, a good fraction of the optimum. But that's a somewhat different question from the one that we study, and maybe you and I will disagree and we'll have a discussion.
So I just hope that you would have mentioned it even if I weren't here. You said that you mentioned it since I'm here. So, yeah, I mean, simplicity versus optimality started as what you're saying. Now there are many various interpretations.
Right.
I mean, at least in the CS literature, yeah, or on the literature on the border of econ and CS, maybe.
Right. So it's a huge topic within CS and the intersection of econ and CS, which this literature is sort of too vast for me to survey. But I still think that these papers here are more closely related, which is why I talk more about them. And I just hint at an interesting discussion that we could have about CS literature as well.
Yeah, for sure.
All right. Now the model. So here, essentially what I have to do in the model section is sort of clarify exactly our assumptions and also introduce all the notation for extensive form games, because in some sense, unfortunately, for OSP and SOSP, we need extensive form games. So what I'm going to do is do it extremely quickly because it's standard and you don't need to sort of remember any of that notation. So it'll be super quick. So I apologize if it's too quick, but I want to save some time for results. So we're going to have a finite set of agents, an arbitrary set of alternatives. Agents are going to have types, and in fact, type spaces are going to be finite. There'll be some prior distribution over types, and agents will have private values. So the utility function will only depend on the type of the agent. The designer is allowed to have a general utility function that depends on the outcome and the type profile. The designer throughout is an expected utility maximizer. We make no such assumption about agents because it will not be necessary given the solution concepts. And then to think about randomization in the mechanism, we're going to introduce a dummy agent called nature, and it's going to be a sort of a non-strategic player for whom the designer is going to choose a strategy. It's a way to talk about randomization. Whenever you see this bar above a variable, it means a profile that includes nature as a player. So here's the notation that we need for an extensive form game. So again, you don't need to remember this. There's a set of histories. There's an empty history from which the play starts. Histories are ordered by precedence. There are some terminal histories at which the game ends. With every terminal history, we associate an outcome. Right? Then we have information sets for agents. Agents choose from an action set at every information set. A pure strategy just prescribes an action at every information set. Then we have strategies. Again, this S bar is a profile of strategies for all players, including nature. And then we can specify that if we start with some history H and play proceeds according to strategies S bar, we end up in some terminal history. And then pi naught is the distribution over nature strategies chosen by the designer. That was super quick. So now let's formally define those three solution concepts. First, strategy proofness. So this is the completely standard definition that we fix the strategy profile for other people, and the strategy SI is dominated if it performs weakly worse than some other strategy SI prime for any such profile, with inequality being strict for some profile of other players. There's just one thing that's not standard for econ, at least, is that because there's a bar here, we also fixed a pure strategy for nature, which means that we require a dominant strategy also with respect to outcomes of the randomization. Okay, so in economics, typically we would compute expectations over nature's moves. Here we require that for every realization of the randomization device, the strategy SI is worse than SI prime. And we do this because that's assumed for OSP and SOSP, just to be consistent. And I did want to mention that in CS, actually this seems to be, I'm not so sure, Yannai, maybe you can correct me, this seems to be the standard definition, at least in this paper, for example, they define it this way. And then they have this truthful and expectation term required for, reserved for the case when the agent takes expectations over randomization devices.
So you know, there's a bit of a question of like, it also relates to whether you want things to be exposed or ex interim. Let me just ask one thing. I've seen both of these. Actually, for me, I think that the other one is a bit more standard, but I'm not sure if because I'm more on the border with econ than many of my community, or because that's become more prevalent. But let me ask you about this. So I've seen papers that actually also define OSP in a middle way, in the sense that you could have nature randomization only on the leaves of the tree.
Mm-hmm.
And then you could, when you're doing your OSP reasoning, you can say the expectation of of what you're going to get in the leaf, but only with respect to the randomization on the leaf, not with respect to like choices nature makes in between. There are I think some groups in the AI community that have looked at that definition. So basically, you said that you only require this kind of realization dependent in SP to make it like OSP and SOSP. Said that you were looking at that kind of OSP and at this kind of SP, which does also randomizations. Is anything in your results sensitive to this, or would that work anyway?
So we use this assumption for some of our results, not all of them. So I will indicate when we use them.
Thank you.
It's not essential. So, for example, in the initial example in my introduction, that did not rely on randomization in any way, because the mechanism was in fact deterministic. But there's one example coming up where we are going to use this to some extent, and we could wonder if we adopt this intermediate notion, if it will go through or not. We can come back to this when I present the example.
Okay, great, thank you.
Yannai, was your question just whether like the end nodes have lotteries assigned to them or deterministic outcomes, or was it deeper than that?
It was that.
It was that. Okay, all right, that's right.
Because sometimes you have allocation constraints that actually,
Let me make one quick comment, because Jiangtao and I sort of discussed this multiple times. We were going back and forth. You can sort of include in the X the set of primitive outcomes, lotteries, and you can then specify these utilities to be expected utilities. And then in some sense, randomization in the usual sense is embedded in this framework. So maybe that's a version of asking a nice question. But in any case, we sort of use this definition for one particular point in this talk where I'm going to indicate that. Right, OSP, now instead of fixing the strategy profile for other people, we're going to take the sup and the inf, right? So a strategy is obviously dominated if the best that can happen under it is still worse than the worst that can happen under the alternative strategy SI prime. Okay, and there is a detail because we have to look at points of departure of those strategies in the game tree. I'm gonna skip that in the interest of time. And then SOSP, that's the notion introduced by Marek and Peter, additionally throws into the sup and the inf future moves of the same player. Okay, so now a strategy is going to be dominated if the best that can happen, where best is taken over other people's strategies, nature's moves, and my own future moves, is still worse than the worst that can happen under some alternative strategy. Then the strategy is SOSP dominated. right? So from now on, we fix the solution concept, fix the one that you like the most. And the assumption we're making formally is that no type of any player is going to play a K-dominated strategy. Right? So depending on what K you choose is going to be a different assumption about agent's rationality. Whatever assumption you made, we can now, for any mechanism gamma, right, which is just an extensive form game, we can compute for every agent and every type of every agent the set UIK of undominated strategies, K undominated strategies. This is a non-empty set given that the mechanism is finite. And now we can formally define confusion. So confusion just means that for some type of some player, this set contains two non-payoff equivalent outcomes, or strategies, I should say. And in such case, we call the mechanism complex. So just removing dominated strategies does not lead to a point prediction. At least one type of one agent will have two non-equivalent choices and the set of undominated strategies. And a mechanism is simple otherwise if no type is confused. So I'm almost done with the formalism. So now we can define payoffs for the designer. So V of gamma is going to be the range of possible payoffs for the designer as we iterate over all possible selections from this correspondence of undominated strategies for all types. So if this is a simple mechanism, then this is essentially a singleton. So there's only one selection, and so this is going to be a point, not a line. But if it's a complex mechanism, then there are multiple ways in which we can assign those undominated strategies. So this expected payoff for the designer is going to be, in general, a line, right, an interval. And so now we can formally define.
What does the CH mean?
Convex hull.
Oh, okay.
So we allow this confusion to be resolved in a stochastic way, and then you can sort of convexify the payoff of the designer. So this is a convex hull. Yeah, sorry. So what's strong dominance of a mechanism? So now a mechanism gamma can be said to be strongly dominated if there exists a mechanism gamma prime such that even in the best case of the selection under gamma, we get something strictly worse than in the worst case of our gamma prime. And really we're interested in just one case of this definition when gamma is going to be the optimal simple mechanism. So the soup here will not be required. If this is a simple mechanism, just the payoff from that mechanism. And then regardless of how we select those undominated strategies, this complex mechanism gamma prime is going to be guaranteed to lead to a strictly higher payoff. I should mention, I haven't said that yet. In fact, half of our paper is about weak dominance, which is a weaker notion in which the best simple mechanism and the complex mechanism are just as good in the worst case, and then the simple mechanism is better in the best case. And I'm just not talking about this, sorry, because I don't have time, but I just wanted to mention that in the paper we also discuss weak dominance. Today I'm just focusing on the strong dominance, which is in some sense a more striking case. All right, that's it. So now I want to talk about, in fact, two results. I won't have time to talk about three of them, but two. So I want to talk about the Gibber-Satterthwaite theorem and how we can circumvent it using complex mechanisms. And then I want to come back to the trade platform example and to the discussion we had with Peter about participation constraints and clarify a little bit why this example worked and what are the limits of this result. And it'll be clear, I think, that we don't know much. So there's this, sorry, I'm wasting time, but Andrew Wiles, the mathematician who proved Fermat's last theorem, has this beautiful analogy that exploring a new piece of math or I guess economic theory is like walking in a dark room where you don't know where things are, so you kind of bump into walls and trip over stuff, and you don't know where you are, and then you find a light switch, and you finally see something, and then you keep looking for the main light switch. And so we're at the stage where we sort of found 2 or 3 very, very small like bed lights, so we can see a little bit around us, but most of the room is still dark. I want to just show you those 2 little lights that we found. Okay. Here's the general idea for this first observation, and then an example using Gibber-Satterthwaite. So there's a certain weakness of simple mechanisms, which is that they require that all types are not confused, right? However, there might be cases in which behavior of some of these types in the type space are not very significant for the designer because they have low probability or they do not contribute to the designer's payoff too much. And so there's a trade-off, right? Sometimes when you add new types to the type space, the set of implementable outcomes shrinks. And then you kind of have the choice of either making the mechanism simple for all these types, or you can sort of ignore the types that are in some sense insignificant and only make the mechanism simple for a subset of the type space, right? And sort of you get a better outcome for the subset of the type space at the cost of ignoring the remaining types and potentially making them confused. So there's a trade-off, and that trade-off might sometimes be resolved in favor of a complex mechanism. So here's a formal result that says that it's actually a very simple result. It's there's just a lot of formalism that obstructs the picture a little bit. But we're going to say that an outcome, just a mapping from types into distributions over outcomes, is simply implementable if there exists a simple mechanism that implements that outcome. Simple meaning, you know, by fixing a solution concept, we get a class of simple mechanisms. And then we're going to say that the environment, which is just the type space and the utilities of agents, has the AAT property, accommodation of additional types, if the following is true. You start from some type space and you look at all possible outcomes on that type space. You add one more type. And if this property is satisfied, there's always a way to give a dominant strategy to that one new type without disturbing the outcome on the original type space, right? So imagine a single crossing auction, right? You have some types, you can always add a new type. And by single crossing, you can always find a dominant strategy for that new type. In fact, because the IC constraint is only going to bind against one single existing type, and the type on the original type space does not change, right? But sometimes this property is going to be violated. So you add a new type, and the only way to give this new type a dominant strategy will be to perturb the outcome of the mechanism on the original type space. That's when there is a trade-off between making the mechanism simple for everyone versus sort of ignoring this new type and making that new type confused by having a better outcome on the original type space, right? So formally, when this AAT property fails, there exists at least some payoff functions for the designer such that the best simple mechanism is going to be strongly dominated. And so that's sort of an abstract version of this. Let me make it concrete by looking at an example. So this is in the context of the Gibber-Satterthwaite theorem. So we have two agents and three alternatives, A, B, C. Right? Each agent type is just a ranking of the alternatives, right? So there are 6 types for every agent. And then we're going to assume that this is just for specifying the designer's utility. Agents are going to get 1 if they get their first choice, half if they get their second choice, 0 otherwise. Distribution of types is IAD uniform. And the designer wants to maximize agent's utility, but she's Rawlsian and risk averse. So risk averse because this is some concave utility function, and Rawlsian because she only cares about the utility of the type that's worse off. Right, so if these are U1, U2 are utilities of those two agents, this is the utility that the designer gets. Right, here's exactly when I use the assumption about randomization, coming back to our discussion about randomization. Because I'm assuming that there has to be dominance for every outcome of the randomization device, I can, without loss, look at deterministic mechanisms when I look for the best simple mechanism. And then I can apply the Gibber-Satterthwaite theorem to conclude that the best mechanism here, the best simple mechanism, in fact, for any K, is dictatorship. So if I used here the definition of dominance where I take expectation with respect to randomization, then the best simple mechanism could involve randomized outcomes. So that's one place where I'm using this. Okay. All right, but with this definition, the best you can do in the class of simple mechanisms is dictatorship. You make the role player the dictator, and that's it. So here's how we can have a complex mechanism that's actually better. And so in this mechanism, you're going to sort of take away some power from the dictator, because she won't be allowed to choose the outcome. She'll only be allowed to choose a menu from which the column player will make the final selection. All right, and so specifically, the role player can still choose A or B, but she cannot choose C, but she can eliminate B from the menu. Right, so the dictator, the previous dictator, can now choose A, B, or not B, in which case the choice between A and C is delegated to the column planner. All right, so this mechanism is complex. Well, the first four types, A, B, C, A, C, B, B, A, C, B, C, A, they of course retain their K-dominant strategies because their first choice is still available in that mechanism. Type CAB has a K-dominant strategy, again, under any solution concept, to eliminate B, because this way she just gets rid of her worst possible outcome. So this is still dominant, and also obviously and strongly obviously dominant. But type CBA is going to be confused, right? Because if she chooses B, this menu B, she gets B for sure, which is her second option. If she chooses the menu AC, then she either gets her first or her third choice, depending on the choice of the column planner. So she's confused. She cannot rank these two strategies, okay? And in fact, it takes some argument, but it's not hard to show that this is a violation of the AAT property. So if you want to keep this outcome for the first 5 types, there is no way to make type CBA not confused. You have to confuse CBA in order to implement this outcome for the remaining 5 types, okay? All right, so here's what's gonna happen. Here's the complex mechanism. So the first 5 types have a K-dominant strategy. The final 6th type, CBA, is confused. So she might either choose to eliminate B or to choose B. We cannot tell, given the assumption about this type's rationality. And I claim that this complex mechanism is going to be strictly better for the designer, regardless of this type CBA resolves her confusion. And the reason why it's going to be a better mechanism is precisely because it's going to perform strictly better on this smaller type space with just 5 types. To see that, notice that the first 4 types have exactly the same outcome in both cases, right? ABC to BC8, it's the same outcome. So we just have to focus on the remaining 2 types. Conditional on type CAB, this complex mechanism offers a clear improvement for the designer. These red numbers are just utilities of the agent that is worse off in that outcome. And you can clearly see there's a point-by-point improvement, strict improvement in expectation for the designer. So conditional on that smaller type space, the designer is strictly better off. Now this in the complex mechanism comes at the cost of confusing CBA, but here you can make a very simple calculation and prove that even though this complex mechanism in the worst case of a disselection is somewhat worse than the simple mechanism conditional on the type, in expectation, you still get a strictly higher payoff with this complex mechanism. Okay. So essentially, there is a way to get around Gilbert-Satterthwaite impossibility by making one of those types confused, because you get a much better outcome conditional on those first 5 types.
So sorry, the expectation here is assuming that types are drawn uniformly at random,
yes,
right?
Yes,
that was my question too.
Right, and this matters a little bit. There's a more sort of crude way of making this example work. If you assume that type CBA has very low probability under this prior, then this becomes kind of an immediate argument. But we chose the uniform to show that this is not kind of a knife edge case again. It holds for a kind of a nice regular distribution as well.
And so the designer's objective function was it sensitive to that? You had a very specific min and then this V function.
Yeah, and so we had to work a little bit to make this example work. But so one comment is if we make this type very unlikely, then it works for almost an arbitrary objective function of the designer. But if you, for example, make the distribution of types uniform, but you just take the usual utilitarian objective for the designer, then it doesn't work. Because the point is there's a trade-off. So it's the trade-off that we want to emphasize. And so sometimes the trade-off will be resolved in favor of the simple mechanism, sometimes the complex one. We just chose one instance in which the complex one does better. But again, the main point is that there is a trade-off and the complex one could be unambiguously better. And so in fact, that's where I'm going with this more general conclusion here, is that more generally, this AAT property will fail in many classical social choice environments, and then you should suspect that it might be the case that a complex mechanism is better. So for example, we know from Gilbert-Satterthwaite that more generally, if there are at least 3 alternatives, then essentially you have to use dictatorship, right? But there's a big literature showing that if you have well-behaved preferences, for example, single-peaked preferences, then there are other mechanisms, less trivial ones, that are also feasible, like generalized median voter mechanisms, right? And so essentially, if you have a type space and a distribution over types such that those well-behaved single-peak preferences have a very high probability, then instead of forcing the mechanism to be simple for all types, you might instead choose to focus on the regular types in some sense and make the remaining irregular types confused. And then, yes, you're going to get a complex mechanism, but it's going to perform better potentially on the well-behaved types that might have higher probability. And by the way, so Yannai has actually a paper that characterizes OSP implementable and unanimous social choice functions for single peak preferences. So we can build this example for OSP as well by relying on these characterizations, right? So that's sort of the first thing we know, that this AAT property identifies settings in which we might suspect that complex mechanisms are better than simple ones. Right, I only have about...
The AAT property, does it depend on, are you fixing the solution concept there, or was this just about the payoff environment?
It's about, sorry, I went through this quickly. We also fixed the solution concept.
Okay.
Because when we say that an outcome is simply implementable, we mean simple in the fixed sense. It's either OSP implementable or SP or SOSP implementable. So yes, it depends on that. And in this particular example works for all three solution concepts, but part of the reason is it's a static mechanism. So like OSP and SOSP are sort of by definition the same. All right, so let me now go to the final. So I'm gonna skip this one section where I talk about single agent mechanisms, and go to the final one where I'm gonna try to explain the initial example. And here we're also gonna show an optimality foundation for simple mechanisms. So this is gonna come back to Peter's question about participation constraints. In fact, let's formally define the thing I said then. In a simple mechanism, it's clear what it means to be exposed individually rational, right? Because in a simple mechanism, every agent has a unique dominant strategy, and that strategy just must yield a non-negative payoff in all cases. That's what it means to be exposed individually rational. But as we already discussed informally, there are two ways to extrapolate this condition to complex mechanisms. Either you just require that at least one of those undominated strategies yields a non-negative payoff in all cases, and we're going to call this partial incentives to participate. Or you can require that all undominated strategies are better than non-participation, in which case we're going to call this full incentives to participate. And I think which of this is more desirable depends on how you think about non-participation. Are you thinking of this as just another strategy? If yes, then I think the first one is compelling. Or do you think of this as an ability of the agent to walk away from the mechanism ex post? Then I think the second one is perhaps more compelling. So it sort of depends on what you want. All right, so we're going to prove well, not prove, it's proven in the paper. I'm going to state it here. A result that predicts that dominance is not possible. Okay, and roughly speaking, the premise of this result is going to be that we'll solve a relaxed problem in which we relax some IC constraints, and if the relaxed problem has the same value as the original problem, then dominance by a complex mechanism will not be possible. So that's where we're going. I need a little bit of formalism to state this. So the way we're going to relax the AC constraints is by considering trees, directed wooded trees in the type space, right? So a tree is just a collection of edges between types, and it's a wooded tree, a directed tree. Each directed edge, let's say between theta I and theta I prime, corresponds to the incentive constraint that type theta I does not want to adopt the strategy of type theta I prime. And again, depending on the solution concept, this will have different meanings, right? Depending on whether you use SP, OSP, or SOSP. So now we want to fix a tree for every agent. And by the way, the simplest example of a tree is just a linear order on types. And if you have a single crossing, a single item auction, it's very intuitive that incentive constraints are only going to bind locally downwards. So this tree is going to be just a total order in the same order as types are just increasing, right? But in general, it's a tree. And now, what is the relaxed problem? In the relaxed problem, we only impose incentive constraints for the edges of the tree, right? So the full problem, there is an edge between any two types because you want incentive constraints for all types. Here, we only impose them along the edges of the tree. And then there are two versions of this result. I'm going to explain now. So suppose you solve this relaxed problem for some collection of trees. So we relax the AC constraint, you only impose it along the edges. And moreover, you only impose the IR constraint for the root of each tree. So we also relax the IR constraint. And suppose you get the same answer as in the non-relaxed problem. So intuitively, only the constraints you included in the relaxed problem were binding or relevant. If you get the same value for the relaxed and non-relaxed problem, then the optimal simple mechanism cannot be strongly dominated by any mechanism with partial incentives to participate, right? So even if you look at a complex mechanism with partial incentives to participate, which is this weaker notion, it still cannot be that the optimal simple mechanism is dominated, right? Intuitively, again, if you take a single unit auction with single crossing, those trees are going to be just linear orders in the type space, and you only have to impose the IR constraint for the lowest type. And intuitively, that's enough to capture all the relevant constraints. So in this case, this premise is going to hold, right? But in more complicated problems, in which IC constraints can potentially bind in both directions, this premise is going to fail. So in some sense, you can already hopefully start to see that our initial example will fail this premise, this condition, because trade could happen in both directions, and therefore IC constraints could bind in both directions. Okay, but there's a second version of this result. Now it's a smaller relaxation in which we relax IC constraints, but we impose IR constraints for all types. If then the value of the relaxed problem is the same as the original one, we get a weaker conclusion because we relax fewer constraints, and we get a weaker conclusion that the optimal simple mechanism is not dominated by any mechanism with full incentives to participate. So there was a lot of words in a short amount of time. But the idea is, in both cases, you relax IC constraints. In one version of the result, you also relax IR constraints, in what you don't, and in the other one you don't. And depending on which one you take, you either get the conclusion that a simple mechanism is not dominated by a mechanism of full incentives or partial incentives. And running out of time, so let me just say what it means in the context of the example, and then I'll stop. By the way, the proof of this and the statement is closely follows a very nice, insightful idea of Yamashita from 2015. All right, what's the consequence for our initial example? If, like Peter said, we want to have full incentives to participate in that example, so for every undominated strategy, the agent should get a non-negative payoff, then this result applies. And in fact, these are the trees for the original example that show that this relaxed problem has the same value as the optimal simple mechanism, and so we can prove that it wouldn't be possible to have the same example with full incentives to participate. And let me just mention, it's an open problem if even such an example can be constructed for revenue maximization. We don't know. But that's this is how we prove what I said earlier to Peter, that we could not build the same example with those full incentives. On the other hand, with partial incentives to participate, we already we've shown an example of strong dominance, and indeed what fails. So it must mean that the assumption of the proposition is violated, and indeed it's just you can relax IR constraints and do strictly better in the relaxed problem. That's why the proposition does not apply. And so let me just wrap up by saying why this complex mechanism works. So in a simple mechanism, the same dominant strategy for any type must both dominate non-participation and dominate the strategies of other types. Okay, but what you do in a complex mechanism is you give the type 1 of either be two strategies One is sort of designed to dominate non-participation, and the other one is designed to dominate the strategy of the other type. So you kind of give yourself more degrees of freedom to play with those strategies. You don't have to choose the same one to play those two roles. You can kind of separate that, and this allows you to sort of partially exploit the benefits from relaxing the IR constraint. That's what sort of happens in this example, right? And I had to cover this very quickly, and this is not a complete intuition, but at least it starts to cast some light on what is and what isn't possible in the context of revenue maximization. Right, I believe I should wrap up to leave some time for discussion, so we can come back to these points if I confused you. But let me conclude for now. So if agents are unsophisticated strategically, if you use a simple mechanism, you know what's going to happen. So that's definitely a benefit of using a simple mechanism. But what we showed is that sometimes, at least, it may be better to sacrifice this prediction ability in order to achieve an unambiguously higher pay by making the mechanism purposefully complex for the agents. And so what this says is not that simplicity is an undesirable feature. We're far from that, in fact, but it does say that you should sort of carefully examine each environment in question before deciding on this question of simplicity versus complexity. And we believe there are many interesting directions for future research. As I said, we really don't understand much yet. So one thing I do want to say, precisely because Yannai is here and we can have a discussion about that as well, is computational simplicity, right? So one intuition that we have is that maybe one reason why complex mechanisms are less desirable in practice is that perhaps it's computationally more difficult to find your undominated strategies, or even to find one undominated strategy, than it is to verify that you have a dominant strategy. So that could sort of help explain maybe why in practice, simple mechanisms have an advantage from a computational point of view as well. The other direction I want to emphasize, in the hope that some experimentalists will get interested in that, is that it will be very interesting to test this in the lab. So those theoretical results predict that if agents are not very sophisticated, there are cases in which complex mechanisms will unambiguously outperform simple ones, but it will be really cool to see if that's really the case in a lab. I'm going to stop here because I do want to leave time for questions and a discussion.
Okay, thank you. Maybe there is a very long question by Arda in the chat, but maybe I'm going to let Peter and Yannai say something if they want to say something, and then I'll open it up for Arda and other people. Who wants to go first?
Yannai, what doesn't matter. I'm not sure I have.
Okay, so let me ask two things. So first of all, since you're giving a guarantee for even for the worst case, let me ask this a different way. So what's not like the least compelling thing for me, and it's not saying that it's not compelling, it's like, is you yourself have acknowledged the fact that this kind of weak dominance of IR may not be very desirable, so you would like to have full dominance of IR. But if at the same time you're saying that IR is not, like, non-participation is not different than any other strategy, then why single it out? If you think that it's important enough to have full domination over IR, then you should have full domination over any other dominated strategy. So that gives you back to an OSD mechanism. So I'm wondering, maybe not go that far, but maybe have you thought about somehow introducing some kind of uncertainty aversion by the agents, or something that, if they're like a kind of price for being confused in some sense? Right, I was wondering if you thought about that kind of direction.
Right, so it's a great question. So So first of all, on the participation, quickly, I think it really depends on the setting, right? So again, in some settings, you have the option always to sort of walk away exposed. And then non-participation is different from all other strategies in that it's sort of an option that you always have exposed. And then I think those full incentives to participate is the right notion. If you sort of commit to participation once you start participating, then I agree that this partial notion is more compelling. So I think there is no way to sort of decide once and for all. You have to look at the setting. Now,
fair enough.
regarding your second point, so and I think Jiangtao can correct me, but at least I believe that this is sort of the most compelling argument in favor of a simple mechanism, which is this, that we have not accounted for some sort of mental costs for those agents if they engage in a complex mechanism, right? So simple way to see that, so suppose there is some sort of spectrum auction, and if it's a simple design, then you should just bid your true value or something like this, so you just do that. If it's a complex one, even if you know that you should participate, you still probably want to exert some effort or even financial cost to ask ask for advice from an expert to try to figure out what you should do. So there might be sort of additional financial or mental costs associated with participating in a complex mechanism. And that's something that we don't account for. And really, I don't think there is a theoretically compelling way to talk about those mental and financial costs. So I think that's sort of the best defense of simple mechanisms, even if they are strongly dominated. But again, our theory doesn't have much to say about that.
Yeah, for sure. But let me just focus what I meant. So I would imagine like imposing an additional restriction. This, granted, this is out of model. It's not as elegant, et cetera, et cetera. But I was wondering if you thought in that direction of saying, well, maybe when I'm confused between two strategies, then, obviously saying that I will always choose the worst option is too strong. But maybe saying something like, when I think about participation or when I think about something like that, then, I should at the very least give like a 50% chance of being confused or even more if I'm averse to that kind of uncertainty. So I'm wondering if I realize it's super outside the model. I was wondering if you just had given any thought to that direction or something like that.
So with strong dominance, not really, because in some sense, if under strong dominance, the agent is not picking the worst possible thing, that's even better for us. That's even sort of better for the complex. But we have thought about this quite a bit in the complex of weak dominance, which we haven't talked about. So just to say again, weak dominance would say that in the worst case, the simple and the complex mechanisms are just as good, but the complex one could potentially be better in the best case or in some other cases. So then this opens up a lot of questions of how you should think about that. And we have thought about this quite a bit. So you might say, well, I just focus on the worst case. I don't care about anything else. And then this weak dominance is not enough to sort of support using complex mechanisms. But then you might start to refine it, right? You might say, well, if the agent is confused, what is sort of the most likely thing that she will do? Maybe you can make some assumption about how the agent is going to behave. For example, suppose that in the case the agent is confused, we want to pick an outcome that's consistent with some equilibrium, right? And so we're only going to find this weak dominance compelling if conditional on some equilibrium outcome, the complex mechanism does strictly better than the simple one. So I think there is a lot of scope for sort of fine-tuning the details of this definition of dominance and trying to say more about how the agent behaves when she is confused. For the strong dominance, it sort of doesn't matter, is the point, right?
Yeah.
Peter.
Yeah, I don't know. So I think it's very cool. There's a lot of things to think about still. So this is not intended to sound as a criticism, although it may come off that way, but it seems like a lot of what you have is kind of very carefully constructed examples. And I'm just having a hard time figuring out what like the big picture takeaway of when something is strong. I don't know if you have any, we're still in the dark room, I guess, is what is
yeah, that's exactly what I was trying to be upfront about.
So I'm just like, if I look at like something like a very simple, just basic auction, right? Just like a single unit normal auction, we kind of know there's no loss in going from sort of Bayesian to like, OSP, and even in our paper, like this one step simple. So those things cannot be strongly dominated then.
Yes,
right?
and that follows from this result.
Does that follow from this result that you showed? Okay, that follows.
Yes, because basically in those very simple settings with a single item, single crossing, IC constraints only bind locally downwards. This defines a tree very, very easily.
I see.
And this applies. So in fact, I skipped.
Okay, so I think I need to understand that result maybe is something that what I was getting at is like, what can we say more generally? I haven't really fully understood that one, so I think that's good.
Yeah, sorry, because I had to go through this quickly.
Yeah.
But yeah, so this says that in those most classical settings and also some more complicated settings that are listed here, you don't have to worry about at least strong dominance. So this is sort of reassuring that you need something sufficiently non-standard to build such examples. But the trade platform example hopefully was not too contrived. And I don't think that the example I've shown relied on those particular numerical values that we've chosen. What really happens in this example is that you cannot determine the direction of IC constraints ex ante. Mm-hmm. Right? Depending on the exact setting, the IC constraints might bind in all types of directions, and that's exactly when you might expect that complex mechanisms are better. And just one comment, we were hoping that we can turn this intuition into an if and only if condition of some sort, that like, if this condition does not hold, then we can construct an example of strong dominance, but it's hard. We were not able to.
So it's hard in the sense you just don't know the answer yet, or you have?
We don't know the answer. We don't know the answer.
So regarding that intuition, does this break if you take a directed acyclic graph instead of a tree?
So that proof would not work of that proposition.
Because it's still like it's kind of the same intuition that you described makes me think of undirected graphs as well, right? But like acyclic graphs, directed acyclic graphs. So I'm wondering if I got the intuition wrong or if it's.
No, so I think your intuition is correct, but I think the proof wouldn't go through. Mm-hmm. And the reason is that, so here's roughly how the proof works. I'm not sure if we'll have a minute left, but let me try to give you a hint at least. The proof works by sort of starting at the root of the tree. You give that type any undominated strategy, and then you can take any other type, and there's always a way to assign an undominated strategy to that type that dominates the strategy you assigned to the previous type. Mm-hmm. Right? And you can do it recursively. That's what defines a tree.
Yeah, but also for a directed acyclic graph, you can start with, there is a way to go by induction so that you always handle a node after you've handled other predecessors.
Oh, but so actually, sorry, I should clarify. It might be that your definition is exactly our definition of a tree. Because so we'd have to sort of agree on a definition of a tree, because I think that what we mean by a tree is exactly what you mean by a acyclical graph.
Can there be two paths from a node to the root?
No.
No. Okay, so that's the difference. Yeah, I want to allow for that, but not in a way that forms cycles. So, but basically, I'm talking about a partial order in some sense.
Right. So I think that our proof cannot handle this. But I have to go into a little bit more details to argue why. In our proof, there can only be one path, basically, to the root.
Okay.
And I don't know so this just means that the proof doesn't work. I don't know if the theorem is wrong. We don't know.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we're gonna stop the recording now. But Arda, if you have time to stick with us, I'm sure Piotr is happy to discuss your question. I think it's way too long.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
To ask him to read.